off. That's right. Got it. And we're recording. And I was supposed to hit that button, and someone did, and they're a hero. So this session is about titled "Confronting Freedom of Contract with Labor Market Realities." Is really about thinking of worker movement in the contemporary labor market. We are going to have three speakers, Suresh, Larry, and myself. But we're going to start off with kind of an introduction to the panel and the themes that we'll be discussing from Larry.
Thanks, Keds. So these papers are part of the Unequal Bargaining Power Initiative at the Economic Policy Institute that I oversee, and they all will be included in a volume to be published in a special issue of the Journal of Law and Political Economy, which will be published in October. The theme of the volume is a critique of the freedom to contract, equal power assumptions in law and economics and philosophy. My presentation is to make it that each paper doesn't have to frame it. I'm just going to show that the ability to quit, the power of quitting, underlies employment law in a bad way and underlies economics in a bad way. And the realities of the ability to quit are what the papers show. So okay. So first, in employment law, the assumption is that an employee's ability to quit is comparable and corresponding to an employer's ability to fire someone. And it is on this basis that we have at-will employment, and famously, that employer can fire you for a good cause or no cause or even a bad cause. And this equality is, that defies common sense, but it underlies a tremendous imbalance of power in the labor market. This is not an old thing. Just in 2018, the Epic Systems case, which was on whether employees could band together in arbitration, even in a private corporate setting rather than through the courts. The Gorsuch starts out and just basically says, should we accept what people agreed to? And even though what they agreed to was Epic Systems sent people an email in the middle of the night and said, if you show up to work tomorrow, you agree that there will be forced arbitration, individual arbitration. Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote a great dissent saying, hey, we got to take into account power. Okay, so economists, you've been on the wrong side of this as many things. And here's a quote that I grabbed from Suresh. Employees protected from being exploited because you can always get another job. Most recently, Starbucks CEO said, hey, if you don't want to work here, go somewhere else. The market works for you. And back in 2012, in a volume that Cindy Eslin and Michael Wachter put, basically the traditional view of, monopsony, employer power is really not something present very much. And internal labor markets, what employers do within their firms, are disciplined by the fact that employees can quit. Cowan, in a critique of Elizabeth Anderson's private government, says, hey, this monopsony just doesn't exist, and in any case, it doesn't really hurt. So these are the three papers that are being discussed today, and that is it. Thank you very much.
Excellent. All right, Suresh, you're up first.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I'm going to talk fast, probably because that's my predisposition. And I wrote this jointly with Mike Carr, who's in the audience. Yeah, so Larry, I think, teed it up very nicely, so I'll just jump into it. So I think the way to introduce this, at least to like, I don't know, some audience, is to think about like explaining monopsony is like from like seeing like an HR manager, which is that suppose you're told by like the CEO to lower hourly wages at your company by 10%. And you have to ask, like, well, what percent of workers do you think quit? What percent of workers do you think slack off so much that they're fired for cause? How many more workers start applying to your jobs? And the traditional economist view, sort of like the no monopsony view, is that basically eventually, in like not too long, 100% of your workers you'll lose to the competitors, and no one's going to be fired, no one slacks off, and then basically like nobody applies to your job. And so in economics, this is like the number that captures this is, you can think of it as the quit, or the labor supply elasticity facing the firm is basically infinite. And so a small change in wage leads to like everybody leaving very, very quickly. And when you have that view, it implies that the market kind of uniquely determines a worker's value at every firm, because any firm that tries to underbid a worker's value immediately loses to some employer that's willing to bid up that worker's up to their contribution to sales. And so that means that the only sources of wage inequality that are left over are like the things that are like skills, talents, tastes. These are the things that are ultimately determining wage differences, nothing about the kind of firm that you're at. And so when you have this view, you kind of get a bunch of implications that I think, again, Larry sort of gestured at. So you get the law of one price. So for example, which firm or manager hires you winds up being pretty irrelevant. And minimum wages and union contracts kind of always lower employment and output. So they just push up wages. And so the firm has to respond by reducing employment. It's kind of completely superfluous to do anything about merger screening or antitrust in the labor market, because the labor market is always already competitive. It's not possible to change that by sort of changing the boundaries of the firm. And I think most interestingly for the legal implications of it, and we don't talk about this that much in the paper, but I think it's very interesting, is that the idea of compensating differentials kind of is that, you know, every unpleasant, undignified, hazardous working condition is offset by the wage. So you don't need to do any regulation of other working conditions, because there's going to be like some offset in the wage, and you should just let people pay for that. And so the example for that is like value of a statistical life is always calculated from like mortality risk regressed on wages. And you have to basically believe that that regression is telling you something about people's tastes, which is just not true when employers have some sort of degree of wage setting power. But, you know, I think what the evidence is sort of coming out, and what we try to like survey sort of quickly, is that now that with this availability of this granular data, we're basically seeing like firms do matter. So I'm not going to get into this graph, but it's basically showing that when like a worker switches to a good firm, their own wage goes up. And when they switch to a bad firm, their own wage goes down. So the effect of like the firm that they're at is like on their wage is like non-trivial and significant. And this is a recent paper from Ajimoglu et al. Kind of showing like what happens when a manager changes from like a manager that didn't have an MBA to a manager that did get an MBA. And what you see is that what they do is they cut wages and like they lower labor share. And you know, and it's not nearly made up for by any increases in output. So it's like the actual managers and firms that employ you really do matter for wages and working conditions. And so, you know, some other evidence that pushes against this sort of classical view of the labor markets, you know, it's this. I think what pushed it was really this, like how, like, even if it's still a debate, it's so remarkably difficult to find negative effects of the minimum wage on employment. Less that unionization is a harder case, but you know, I think the fact that everyone's looking for it and it's still contested suggests that it's not immediately popping out of the data in any kind of way, and that it's so small that suggests that there's like something else going on. There's also a bunch of papers sort of showing that labor market concentration is negatively correlated with wages. And I think more compellingly, like the direct effect of mergers that significantly raise labor market concentration also lower wages. So this is a few recent papers. It's also remarkably hard to see compensating differentials in the labor market. So if you just do naive regressions, you wind up that good jobs are also high paying jobs and bad jobs are like bad jobs on every other dimension. And I think some of the most compelling evidence, actually, in my view, is this idea is when you look for like exogenous and experimental, quote unquote, like arbitrary changes of an individual employer's wages only lead to moderate changes in quits and recruits. So And I think that's the kind of very direct evidence that like employers have some capacity to set wages, because not everyone is leaving when you actually look at these kind of exogenous wage changes. And so one of the things we do is kind of in the papers, we kind of show like some estimates of the quit elasticity. This is like how much quits change with the wage. And this estimate suggests around like, this is in the low wage labor market, you get something like 2.4 is the quit elasticity. So that suggests like a 10% decrease in the wage results in like a 2.4% increase in the quit rate. So not huge, not nothing. 24%, sorry, 24% increase in the quit rate, not huge, but not nothing. And then it varies by sector. In particular, like low wage sectors have distinctly like lower labor supply elasticities, which means that there's more monopsony power in there. So art, accommodation, and food is kind of one here. But also importantly, and low wage workers, so this is the lowest quartile of wages, but also during the Great Recession, the labor supply elasticity estimates fall. And I think that's an important thing, that like the business cycle, you know, the quit elasticity is kind of pro-cyclical, and it's an important component of like what the relationship between wages and aggregate demand. And this is kind of showing the quit elasticity by group. This is like using the SIP, so it's not the best, not as good as the other data, but it's what we had. And in particular, you can see that like groups that are like historically subordinate, for example, like Black workers, and female workers have lower labor supply elasticities, and so that means they're you know, they're less mobile in response to like wage changes of their employers. Okay, so why do employers have this market power? So I always find this funny, because Larry and I have argued over the use of the term monopsony. It's like, you know, monopsony is generally just used to mean that the firm has some wage setting power, but you know, technically monopsony actually means it's a single seller of fish cakes. The root word is actually from like a seller of fish cakes, and so yes, the language has changed. And so why is there this monopsony power? First, I think is very most importantly is that firms are a bundle of jobs, and firms are not, the jobs aren't competing with each other within a firm. So basically every firm is like a wrapper around a set of jobs that are not competing with each other. Second is this, jobs are embedded. They're like high dimensional and social things where like a whole bunch of other individual characteristics about the job matter for a particular individual. And that means that some people really like the job and some people don't really like the job, and employers don't know who's whom, but they know that some people will stay even if they lower the wage. And then I think there's things about information. Even when job postings are public, your aspirations about what jobs you think you could get, your credible information about what kinds of jobs you think you're good at, these are passed through social networks that are themselves reflective of like all kinds of segregation patterns in the larger society. And so, you know, it's like creates a source of heterogeneous outside options. Okay, I'll conclude by talking about the role of the business cycle. So the key idea here is that when there's high unemployment, employers don't have to poach from each other because they can just have to go to the unemployed pool. And so that like means that there's just not the same competitive pressure in the labor market when unemployment is high. And you can sort of see this by estimates of the quit elasticity being pro-cyclical. So we need more of these. We don't have enough of them, but I think the ones we have like suggest that they're pro-cyclical. And so that sort of suggests that this labor market competition, and more broadly, the space of options that workers have, is kind of dependent on the state of the macroeconomy. And that's something that like lawyers, I think, have a harder time talking about, is just like how the role of just aggregate demand in kind of driving the level of competition. And then I think what we're seeing in this most recent business cycles, like, you know, we're seeing workers have like lots and lots of options, but we're also seeing some of it turning into showing up as like higher inflation. And just a question to like as a hypothetical, if what happens if it's actually really hard for an economy to deliver competitive labor markets without kind of also having to pass along some of that in the way of prices, or if it generates such high consumption that it winds up raising prices. And this is just showing that quits and unemployment rates kind of track each other over the 20th century. So like when the unemployment rate is high, people aren't quitting their job. When the unemployment rate is low, people are quitting their job and like walking away. Okay, and then my conclusion.
You're about at time, just FYI.
I'm out of time. Okay, I'll just leave this up here. Just saying that I think a monopsony is there, but I also think it's not the only thing. There's like lots of other constraints operating on employers. That means that employers aren't necessarily using all of their market power. And I'll leave it at that. Done.
Great. All right, I am next. So I'm going to talk about worker mobility in practice. Is quitting a right or a luxury? So let me move something around real quick. So, like Larry said in his introduction, if you think of kind of a motivating, the relationship between like the legal and economic side of what we're looking at, this notion of at-will employment, has embedded in it that an employer cannot legally prevent a worker from leaving. But of course, that says nothing about the worker's ability to find a new position. And I think that there's a motivating legal question of how meaningful is a right if you, cannot freely exercise it. Now, that would be, steering well outside my lane to talk about that in any meaningful way, since I'm an economist. So in this paper, we really, I really interrogate this idea of the ability to find a new job. Now, the ability to find a new job in the economic lens, as Suresh noted, is really ingrained in this idea of monopsony. All right, there we go. Okay. So I describe monopsony as a market disrupting concentration of employer power that allows the employer to pay the worker less than the competitive wage. And I contrast the idea of a static monopsony, which is, the single employer controls or dominates a labor market, versus a dynamic monopsony, in which the difficulty or inability to leave a position that pays less than a competitive wage gives an employer monopsonistic power to pay lower wages. I think the contrast here is important because at the heart of a dynamic monopsony is really the practical application of worker mobility, right? Can I leave a job? So it's the same question, but kind of in this monopsony framework. And I agree with Suresh, there's not really just one kind of, I think, single definition of monopsony, because there are so many channels over which employers can concentrate power that there are varieties of kind of definitions and applications. So most of the time when we're looking for evidence of monopsony, we look at wages, right? If a monopsony results in the ability to pay a worker less than their competitive wage, then if I'm looking for monopsony, I need to look for a wage that's too low, either because of the market, the occupation, the industry, the nature of the employment contract, or so on, right? And so it's really, you're looking for the result of limited worker mobility via the wages. This paper is going to take the opposite approach, and it's going to look at practical aspects of worker mobility and not really discuss wages. So not, do we think wages are lower in labor markets in which there's high unemployment and fewer jobs, but what does it mean if there are fewer jobs available to search for? So I take two kind of tacks. The first is to look at labor market constraints, and the second is to look at financial constraints. Now, the labor market constraints are really the assumptions that underpin the idea, if I want a new job, I go get one, right? And those three assumptions are: there is an available job, that the worker has time and resources to search for it, and that the job matches the worker's skills and preferences. On the financial side, it's really about the cost of transitioning, whether it's a job to job transition, a job to unemployment to job transition, moving or borrowing to smooth. So for example, a financial constraint could be that, maybe there is not a job in my labor market, but I could move to another labor market or another locality. Moving's expensive. Not everyone has savings, and not everyone has the equal ability to borrow. And the theme throughout the paper is really that it's less about kind of a uniform idea of limits to worker mobility, so much as there is deep inequality in the limits to worker mobility, right? If you have a very high income, you have a very flexible job, you have rich parents, you inherited a fortune, your limit to worker mobility is very much a function of these non-labor market aspects, like your parents' wealth, as opposed to just purely a labor market function. And so for each of these bullet points that I lay out here, I go through and talk about what are the potential assumptions and cost and who bears them differently. So there's not really time or space in the presentation to go through all of them. So I'm going to just talk about search to give you an example of how I interrogate it in this setting and the type of evidence that I bring. So I just kind of think about this in terms of really basic questions like, all right, you decide to look for a job. Who can search during the workday, right? Me, at Rand, I'm in a closet right now. I have, the only person watching me regularly is Lady Perkins behind me. I could spend an hour on Indeed looking for a job and there would be very little surveillance or consequences, right? Which is a very different situation from someone who's, say, a child care worker who cannot sit in a corner on, their phone, looking at Indeed postings, right? Because they have to physically mind children and pay attention to what they're doing. So we proxy for this on the job search by bringing up who can work remotely. And the pandemic kind of illustrated the stark contrast of our high educated, high income workers, low educated, low income workers. So some people are going to be able to have a very kind of much less costly search because they can search just during their workday while they're being paid by another person versus who has to search outside of work. All right, but in that notion, there's still not just a one kind of type of divide, right? There's variation in who has internet connections at home, and we bring this up from the American Community Survey. There's how long job search takes and who has non-work obligations, and particularly the second shift that mothers tend to work when they leave their job, right? And what kind of constraints that puts on that ability. We also talk about, who gets more callbacks. If we do file, say, 50 applications, there's a lot of CPS and various data to point to, but we bring up also research into the disparity and importance of professional networks in finding a job and finding a better paying job, as well as evidence of discrimination in the labor market, specifically through hiring. Right, and then as we kind of chronologically go through this process of searching and getting a callback, there's also the question of who can arrange time for an interview. And we bring up evidence of who has access to paid time off, as well as who has a knowledge of a scheduled shift, right? If you don't know your shift more than a week in advance, how can you set up a job interview in, 2 weeks, right? You don't know if you'll be available, you might not have time off for it, and you could jeopardize your current position. So this is the type of kind of evidence that I bring in the paper. Just to give you an example, I construct this hypothetical model of job search where I talk about this very common finding that Black applicants receive a callback rate at half the rate as white applicants. And so I just construct this very stylized hypothetical model of how many job offers you get based on the number of interviews and the number of applications you file, show that this difference in callback rates can have a very harsh time constraint on how long it takes someone to find a job. And throughout the paper, I go through kind of each of these for the same type of just constructing really practical evidence on what it means to try and leave a job. And it did, y'all weren't keeping time, but I did keep my own time. And we're going to go back to Larry for his paper. Larry, you are muted if you are trying to talk.
Okay, I'm gonna let you see me and hear me. Okay. So on one level, I think this paper is shooting fish in a barrel, which is, I'm just arguing that you have to take into account the unemployment rate and the fact that we mostly have excessive unemployment from the point of view of the worker, if you want to evaluate the ability to quit or the power in the labor market. And, clearly, even the modern monopsony literature, other than Suresh, tends to ignore macroeconomic issues like unemployment and focuses mostly on frictions. And I think excessive unemployment was a conscious policy decision, the Federal Reserve Board and Congress to, not allow labor markets to become heated. And then you also have to wonder with someone like Justice Gorsuch, who wants to bless whatever employers and employees come up with as sacrosanct. Is that true in 2009 when there's very high unemployment, as well as in 2019 when there's very low unemployment? It seems kind of silly to me. So it seems worthwhile to examine this. And, just the bottom line is that economics and law ignores unemployment. We are rarely at full employment. If you're non-college educated or Black, the majority of the workforce, you rarely are at full employment. And Black workers never, on average. And the common sense of any citizen would be, when unemployment is high, it's harder for workers and it's easier for employers. I mean, do I really need to present data? The answer is yes. I've made a whole career of shooting fish in a barrel, and it's been necessary. Okay, again, we're rarely at full employment. What happens when there's high unemployment? As Suresh has already shown, the quit rates are lower. People are not able to transition to new jobs. You spend more time trying to find a new job. For employers, they fill their job vacancies more quickly with less intensity of recruiting. They screen applicants readily. They find qualified workers readily. And in high unemployment, they actually raise credentials. So they're getting more for the dollar paid. And the bottom line is that we know that high unemployment lowers wage growth, especially for low and middle wage workers and for Black and Hispanic workers. Unemployment, if you look at all of the months since 1973, 45% of the quarters, 45% have had unemployment more than 6%, and only 27% less than 5%. So we mostly have pretty high unemployment. If you look by race and education, the average unemployment rate was 6.2% over this time, obviously higher than full employment. Blacks, it was roughly double at 12%, Hispanics, 8.7%. In terms of the months of the unemployment rate, less than 5%, yeah, 26% overall of the quarters were less than 5%. There were no quarters for Black workers where they, on average, experience unemployment less than 5%. If you look at Black high school workers, 81% of the quarters, Black high school educated workers had an unemployment rate over 10%. So here's just to show some pictures about obvious things, how unemployment makes it harder for workers. Here's the ratio of unemployed per job opening back to 1951. This on averages, there's 1.75 unemployed per job opening, meaning that the average is it's much harder for a worker to find a job than an employer to find a worker. Around 29% of the time, 28% of the time, the unemployed per job opening exceeds 2. So this is the overall context. This is another, Suresh made the observation using manufacturing quit rates over a century. This is using quit rate data just over the last 30 years. And quits go up a lot when there's low unemployment. They go down a lot when there's high unemployment. Seems obvious, but it really, really matters. So what you should know is that as the unemployment rate fell from 2009 to 2019, the quit rate rose by 12 percentage points. In other words, a whole 12% of the workforce was quitting each year. And when you had unemployment rise from 2007 to 2009, the quit rate fell by 10.6%. So those are pretty huge impacts, especially because quitting affects not only the workers who quit or don't quit, it also affects the inframarginal worker who is affected. So, data shows that when unemployment rises, jobs are hard to get. That's what the Conference Board shows. Okay, higher unemployment is easier for employers. Here's the recruiting intensity. Recruiting intensity goes up when unemployment goes down. Employers are much more readily are able to fill jobs when unemployment is up. It's harder for them to fill jobs when unemployment is down. This is data for small firms. More small firms say they have problem getting good labor quality when unemployment is low. They have an easy time getting the labor quality they want when unemployment is high. And then, excess of unemployment sapped median wage growth over the 1979 to 2017 period by $2.31 an hour, and or by 11.3%. Josh Bivens and I, in a paper, show that excessive unemployment is the largest single factor explaining wage suppression and the divergence of productivity from median hourly compensation in that period. So, yeah, Milton Friedman, you're not so right. And at will employment, your assumptions stink. And here's the paper. Thank you.
Thank you for that very concise conclusion, Larry. All right, we have two discussants, and we're going to start with Brishen, and then we'll go to Lorenzo.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me here. I really love the papers and want to write into my comments. I should say I can't really say much about the methodology here since I'm not an economist, but I'll focus on the legal and policy implications. To start out, I thought I'd just make one comment based on something Suresh said. He said at one point, lawyers have a harder time understanding macroeconomic effects on wages / worker power and the economy generally. And I wanted to ratify that. I think it's 100% true. And I think that's true for both kind of epistemic, I guess, and institutional reasons. Epistemically, there's like no individual conflict between people when it comes to macro level phenomena, which means it's really hard for people who are trained in a common law methodology to make sense of it, because what we're trained to do is to adjudicate conflicts between individuals. And that's just not the case when macro comes into the picture. And then institutionally, law and econ has been very focused on microeconomics, and financial regulation scholars just don't really talk much to labor people. So that's all to say there are really substantial gaps in the lit here, and I'm very happy to see this work being done. Okay, quick comments going, I guess, in reverse order. First on Larry's paper. I think you're absolutely correct that the assumption of equal power between employer and employee permeates employment law and justifies all sorts of real-world power grabs by employers, non-competes, ARB agreements, other reductions in benefits. More on that in a moment. You said shooting fish in a barrel. Perhaps that's true from your perspective. I think from my perspective, it is just very, very helpful to have good documentation of this sort of thing in an accessible form for lawyers, for policymakers. And I thought the charts in the paper and just the evidence in the paper was incredibly helpful. In particular, breaking down by race and educational attainments, the extent to which individuals were actually in markets characterized by full employment, I thought was very helpful and kind of, pointed out the degree of opportunity hoarding on the basis of class and race that happens here. Okay, I have a lot more to say on the other data, but none of that's original. Let me kind of say a couple other things, though. I do think inserting the argument about the lack of full employment into the policy discussion in a more sustained manner would be really helpful. I know you've been trying to do that, but I'd love to hear any thoughts on what that might entail. Suresh and Carr, or Naidu and Carr have the suggestion of having measures of monopsony lead to automatic policy intervention. So are there opportunities to do that here? Trigger enhanced unemployment benefits at certain points and targeted to certain groups, or trigger state investment in job creation, or something else at the Fed that is, matched to levels of unemployment that are below full employment. That's what I'm thinking of. Okay, second then on the law. So the paper's 100% correct, as I said, that the common law of employment tends to assume equal bargaining power. And the Epic Systems case illustrates that pretty well. But there are a couple important counterpoints. So the first is that labor legislation does not usually assume equal bargaining power, as you know. The preamble to the NLRA makes this very clear. Various state employment laws look to indicia of worker subordination or vulnerability in determining employment status. And then if you look at the labor law doctrine, collective bargaining law doctrine in the US, the notion of inequality in the work relationship and freedom of contract coexist. They just kind of like both ideas are there. Other branches of the common law of employment also don't assume equal bargaining power. That's true to an extent in the kind of more granular law around non-competes. It's also true with workplace dignity and privacy protections. So, there are always counter arguments. What to make of this? I think that the freedom of contract side of the equation has really grown in importance in recent decades. Under pressure from law and econ types, from Epstein types and the like, I think post-war labor law didn't presume equality of bargaining power as easily, at least between individual workers and employers. I've written a bit about this and I can send it to you. Cindy Eslin's review of Elizabeth Anderson's book makes a similar argument from a pretty different starting point. I don't know that you need to go into detail there, but to the extent the paper's going to engage with legal scholars, you probably want to, I think, note the contrary doctrine. Okay, second, Kathryn. So as with Larry's paper, I just love the collation and summary of data and the showing of the ways in which restrictions impact workers' decisions. I thought the incorporation of discrimination into the model was especially helpful, as was the incorporation of care and family obligations. On policy relevance, I'd love to hear thoughts you have there. Do we want to think about interventions beyond just at the macro level, addressing lack of transportation, lack of childcare, unemployment benefits? Provocatively, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the occupational licensing debates, which are triggered here, of course, right? To what extent does state level variation in licensing, is that part of the problem? To what extent is licensing itself part of the problem, et cetera? And then from a different direction, what about Danish-style flexicurity or active labor market policies, right? If we really want to encourage movement between jobs, then something like a Danish system, it seems to work pretty well in that context. And is that possible and interesting in the US? Then second, a kind of minor objection. The paper discusses mobility as the core of worker power, and I think that's true, but it's incomplete, right? So workers' capacity to act collectively is an important vector of worker power that's somewhat independent of employer monopsony power. And so the question is whether collective power or associational power could be incorporated into the model. Finally, with Naidu and Carr, so again, love the collation of evidence, especially the historical trends in quit elasticities. I thought it was really powerful, and the difference in quit elasticities among low wage versus higher wage workers. I also very much love the development or building out of the neoclassical model of labor exploitation, or the labor exploitation rate. I had a couple kind of comments, micro level. Page 2 talks about at-will legislation, but at-will is a common law rule, not legislative. So that's worth making a note of. Most employment legislation actually abrogates employment at will. Second is Payne is an old case, and it's oddly, weirdly relevant to this debate because it's sort of an antitrust case, but it's no longer good law for its main holding. That language from Payne is not the main holding. If you need a current site, Epic Systems, I think, certainly gets you there. Gorsuch's majority opinion gets the point across very, very well. Okay, then on the macro level, I want to kind of hear a little more about your definition of monopsony and the utility of the definition. It's partially defined early on and seems basically to have to do with wage setting power. So when quitting a job is costly, employers have power, which we call monopsony power. This doesn't require non-competes, collusion, or concentrated employers, and therefore it's inherent to how laissez-faire labor markets work. So here I have a version of the same comment I gave to Kathryn. There's two dimensions here, right? I mean, you're not going to disagree with any of this, I think, but I want to hear your response. It seems like the effort of the paper is to show that monopsony is a constant and structural feature of labor markets, or at least laissez-faire labor markets. Is it different from what Bowles and Gintis then call short side power? So if a market is defined by a small number of buyers and a large number of sellers, the buyers inevitably have power over the sellers, right? So call that buyer power or market power or short side power. But what exactly is the utility of describing all employer short side power as monopsony power? So I worry that doing so can downplay differences between labor markets that are genuinely concentrated or characterized by pervasive non-competes versus those that are more fluid but still defined by firms hiring employers. So there can be degrees of market power. But then I worry it also might paper over differences between labor markets defined by individualized contracting versus pervasive collective bargaining, right? So there's market power, then there's the absence of countervailing worker power, which is distinct, in my view anyway. And of course, there's plenty of historical and present-day industrial sectors defined by oligopolistic firms and well-established and powerful unions that set terms at the sectoral or national level. Mid-century GM, I think, is pretty different from Uber. I'm finishing here. So this has, I think, significant policy implications, right? Yes, there's this greater and greater data that, more and more papers finding that there is a relationship between market concentration and wages. But there does seem to be a more substantial relationship between unionization rates and wages. So how to think about this set of questions? What's the definition of monopsony, and does it incorporate that set of the questions about countervailing power? Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you much. And Lorenzo.
Okay, perfect. So thank you for having me. I'm really excited to comment on these three great set of papers. I'm also, a big fan of this project, bringing, economics and law into conversation to think about how bargaining power between employers and workers is unequal. Unlike Brishen, I'm not a lawyer. I'm an economist, so I'm going to be talking more about the econ side of these papers. Okay, so just from my point of view, the main arguments of these papers are laid out here. And what I liked about kind of this session was that they all spoke to each other pretty well. So starting with Larry's paper, the main thing I got from it is just the near absence of full employment in the economy kind of puts this freedom of contract framework on weak standing for determining as being the basis for labor law. And the idea here is simply that workers cannot switch jobs as easily as employers can replace workers. And he shows a lot of nice data showing the cyclicality of unemployment, quit rates, job-to-job transitions, and vacancy durations to make that point. Then moving on to Kathryn's paper, I think what I love there was just kind of showing all the different dimensions that can make the cost of quitting oftentimes quite prohibitive. So she really digs into the different parts of the job search, like whether jobs are available, whether someone has even time to search, and then even if you do find a job, what's the quality of the job you find? But then also the fact that transitioning may mean that you lose temporarily certain types of benefits. There's also the cost of moving. And also the fact that certain people may not have the financial cushion to actually be able to, maybe take those costs now, finance them somehow through credit, and then make it to the other side, to the, let's say, higher paying job. And what's interesting there is it really highlights that the brunt of the impact falls on low wage workers and minorities that face discrimination in the labor market, but can also face discrimination in, let's say, credit markets. And then finally to Suresh's and Michael's paper, they're exploring this idea of how, how responsive are quits, and just being able to measure that gives us another measure of the degree of worker exploitation. They make it very clear going through a lot of the econ literature that monotony is quite pervasive, even in markets that initially we would think are competitive, like her papers on, Suresh has a paper on about Amazon Turk. He also cites a paper on Uber and Lyft, how basically just experimentally shifting someone's wage actually doesn't lead to as many transitions as one would expect. And again, as kind of evidence of what was also highlighted in Kathryn's work, these quit elasticities seem to be lower for low wage Black and women. So very nice kind of session. And now I'm going to go through each paper and kind of provide some comments. So on Larry's paper, I think one of the things that I found quite interesting, and this is mostly because of the work I do, most of my research is outside the US, is this idea that in the US, there's kind of this prioritization of individual contracts over collective contracts. And this is actually something that has also been a trend internationally. So many countries that used to, for example, have non-derogation clauses, like it was impossible for an individual contract to have a clause that would derogate something that was negotiated collectively. Those sort of things have been disappearing in countries like Greece and Brazil. So it's interesting to see that even maybe countries that one thought maybe fell more on the collective side of the spectrum have been transitioning towards this let's say more individual oriented side. What I was kind of I was putting like my econ hat on and thinking, when, like the opposite side, like when is it that the balance of power would tilt toward workers? And based on kind of your starting point, then that would be essentially when it's easier for workers to switch jobs than to be replaced. And it seems to me that if that is the case, then it's probably not even true at full employment. Like despite, and this is something that I feel like should be mentioned somewhere, but I know it's in the back of your mind. But there are costs to employers whenever they're replacing someone. They're obviously, in my view, not bigger than the cost that individuals face, like the search and training costs. And they also face uncertainty about match quality, right? But even if you have those things, even at full employment, it seems that even in that case, the worker would not have would have the upper hand. And that led me to think about, what are sort of the policies, and Brishen actually also brought some of this up to the fore, that one could think about, like, should we have focus on policies that place barriers on firms' ability to replace workers? Like, we think about something simple like increasing severance payment or like increasing firing costs, for example. But then there are also policies that could facilitate job transition, like active labor market policies, things like that, which would be most fitting to, let's say, rebalance the current power relation. Another important thing, and it's really unfortunate the language that economists use, but economists really care a lot about productivity, and there's this notion of whether recessions are cleansing or sullying, and I think it's unfortunate that the language they use, but it is the idea that there's this paper by Haltiwanger and co-authors that are kind of looking at what happens during recessions and expansions, and they do find that during recessions, the firms are actually firing the least productive workers. So in some sense, there is a average productivity in the firm increases during these recessions, so that would be good for the firm. But then also the job ladder, the ability for productive workers to climb up the job ladder kind of falls apart. So productive workers end up, staying at less productive firms. And during expansions, then that's when the high productivity firms are able to poach the good workers from the low productivity firms. And this is all to say that, when you're thinking about productivity in general, or when you insert that into the equation, the policies we put in place kind of matter, or you kind of have to speak to that in some sense. And this is why, and this is not anywhere in what was presented, but it seems to me, given that there's these productivity concerns and that there's this fluctuation in, let's say, how close we are to full employment or not, that something like a more localized labor market institution, rather than maybe a government like level policy, would seem like a better fit to deal with these issues. It just seems hard to, like the example I have in mind is like some sort of like unions and collective bargaining, where like they have an interest in the firm, but they also represent the right of workers, and they are able to adjust kind of the policies over time with the business cycle. So on Kathryn's paper, really, I just loved all the evidence that was put in front. And I just had thought about other papers like that came to mind that you weren't citing that would be interesting.
You just have 1 minute left, just letting you know.
Okay, so I'll just leave these papers here for you, but it's about how hard it is for people to move under monopsony, about the fact that workers really don't know much about their outside options, and also about how harassment in the workplace affects women negatively. There's like some new empirical evidence of those things. And then the last minute, just what I found interesting about Suresh's and Michael's paper, they focus a lot on quit elasticity with respect to wages, because obviously it's an easier fact to measure and manipulate. And they mention a little bit about productivity shocks, but they're, they worry that firms may adjust in other margins, so those measures of elasticities are not as good. But I really would like to see, more work focusing on these types of other margins of adjustment. And I think there are some causal papers that are starting to look at that. But I guess I'll send this to you via email, Suresh, since I'm running out of time. So that's all to say, excellent work, and I'll stop now.
Wonderful. So we had a couple comments from reviewers. Suresh and Larry, do you want to respond? Just to kind of do a quick overview.
Well, I'll just say the following. I think the modern literature of the people, maybe one or two generations younger than I am, that's focusing on monopsony. I agree. Suresh and I have had this conversation. I don't understand what the word monopsony adds to the concept of employer power. I think it just confuses the populace from actually understanding what's being said. And the focus on frictions ignores two things, which I think is coming up here. One is macroeconomics, the collective position of workers. And second is the things that push back on employer power and their diminution, which is labor standards and and unions. And somehow I think those things get lost. So I'll just stop there.
Yeah, I'll just respond. I think it was like my last slide, if I had unpacked it, I think would have captured some of this. One is, so the point is monopsony, and I think we try to make this point, is that like it's something that's come to be visible because we can see like job to job transitions and the flows of bodies across workplaces in a way that we can't see like effort or fairness or all these other constraints that we know are there, but they're actually very hard to measure. And so monopsony winds up being like the constraint on firms' wage setting that we can see, even if it's not necessarily the one that's binding. And so I think like I see it as an entry point into all of these issues, not nearly the final word on it, because it's something that we can operationalize in data and see it and quantify it. And so I think that's and it's really only the constraint in like laissez-faire labor markets where employers get to set the wage unilaterally, not in some sort of like bargained environment, not in a world where like the wages are constrained by government mandates, and it's not even the case that employers even know how to set wages. I have this paper showing just like the pervasiveness of round numbers in wage setting. It's like employers don't know how to set how to even use all the monopsony power they have. And I think particularly, well, for the intersection between the associational power and monopsony, is that often these constraints are either, even when they're not a formal union, there's often a sort of strong set of workplace norms that wind up restraining the exercise of monopsony power. And so you're not going to wind up seeing it used, because even in the absence of some of these things, because you can imagine there's sufficient like workplace culture that just like, nope, this is how we set wages and you can't deviate from that. And I think that's very interesting. And it's like, gives you an actually, and here's sort of the most, the follow on from that is that imagine employers know that, and then they want to actually use their monopsony power even more, because they understand that like high turnover diminishes that associational life at the workplace. And so you want to break the norms. And so you like lower the wage even more to generate even higher turnover than even the profit maximizing level would be. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and I'll respond to say that we brought up Brishen to push me farther on policy and, recommendations from this. And I think, you brought up some things that I think I would tie together into what are the structural barriers for worker power that aren't necessarily related to labor, like direct labor policy. So I think about things like, how we get health insurance, how we get childcare, the types of constraints that there are to childcare and transportation. So at the moment, I'm a very highly educated, highly paid worker with a lot of mobility, but I'm also 7 months pregnant and I provide health insurance for my family. Like, I'm not quitting. Right. And there's no way that my employer doesn't have a pretty good sense that like Kathryn's not going anywhere for a while, because I'd lose my leave, I'd lose my health insurance. I don't know where I would get it, or if I could afford, COBRA without a steady income. And so it's easier to see these constraints on the workers with the least amount of power, but that's not to say that all workers aren't clipped somehow by having, a true structural deficiency in how our labor market is supported through non-labor policy. So we only have about 5 minutes left, but we do have a lot of participants. And if you have a question, you can raise your hand and hopefully we can do like rapid fire answers and can get to them, which I guess you can do the raise hand feature. All right, Rita, your hand was up first. Your hand is back down.
Okay, hi, I just wanted to say thank you for, raising this. I think it's an important area that from a legal perspective doesn't get recognized as often as it should when we have these assumptions, not just about sort of the employment law and wage side of things, but also, for example, under the National Labor Relations Act. The comments made me think of a dissent in the 2019 LA specialty decision regarding unlawful work rules, and sort of the assumption as to how a reasonable employee would interpret those work rules because of the power imbalance and their dependence on the employer for their livelihood, essentially. I wonder if any of the panelists would want to touch on sort of the chill that happens to employees, not just in, we've discussed why quit rates are the most practical way of trying to get at this imbalance, but sort of other policy factors or remedial action that could be taken on a legal basis for addressing the power imbalance in terms of sort of structural tests that we put in the legal field to evaluate, for example, things like work rules.
I would just point out that mobility is an end stage evidence of the lack of worker power, just the prevalence of FLSA violations and the difficulty that workers have in redressing them, how complaints are handled, how evidence is handled in complaints, right? So I was reading about a case 2 days ago about, someone who took a picture of their punch card every day when they clocked in and out. They submitted that as evidence of their complaint and it was thrown out as being insufficient, right? So I think it's, we're talking about really kind of one edge of worker power that I think being on the job that's not the only limit. The ability to enforce the standards that we have for workers is a massive problem.
Okay.
Okay, Dale Bellman.
One moment. What is the current state of research on the effects of licensing on restrictions in the labor market. It was very popular a couple of years ago. I think the quality of the research is generally extremely low. They're using some weak BLS data, but that's clearly something that people love to cite as a labor market restriction. I was wondering if there's any movement towards improving the quality of that research.
Suresh or Larry?
There is a paper by an MIT grad student whose name I'm like totally blanking on. That is, I think, like a really good, like kind of a very well done study of occupational licensing. And I forget the results, but I'll find it and send it to you.
Okay.
Larry, did you have thoughts on licensing?
Not licensing, but just in terms of some of the comments from the discussants, you know, I think we're in an extraordinary moment that actually shows that worker power ebbs and flows, because we're now seeing, I don't think a permanent shift in worker power, but certainly employers competing for workers, wages rising most at the bottom relative to the middle and top, unemployment dropping, quit rates historically high. This has been driven not by some new consciousness of workers, but by an extraordinarily high amount of job openings and jobs created, which in turn comes from policy, frankly, both Trump and Biden. And this is the first administration in my life that has taken seriously the effort to maintain and get to full employment quickly. And they're paying a price for it, because there's some economists who are blaming them, you know, for the high inflation and all that because of what they actually did. And so, but the administration, when they took a risk, they took risks on the side of workers, on behalf of workers. I've never observed that in 50 years of observing policy. And so that's in some ways, I think, speaking to what I think Brishen was talking up. And I think the simplest way to tell an individual citizen that power matters in the workplace is, we knew in 2020 that employers had the upper hand because they were able to force workers to show up to work when it could cost them their lives. Now we know that workers have the ability to quit, and employers are scrambling for workers. So this is not a constant thing. This has ups and downs. Therefore, it should be incorporated into philosophy, economics, and employment law.
All right, well, it is 12:45 and we are at time. I just want to thank everyone for coming, thank our presenters. That does mean I'm thanking myself, which is awkward, but also thank to the discussants. There is a great day of Lyra ahead of us. If you go back to the page with all the streams, you just click on the breakout stream that you want, and they will, it'll take you right back to the room. The streams are open all day. I didn't realize that, but it should be easy enough to manage. And have a great conference, and thank you again, everyone.
And thank you, Michael, who didn't get to talk, but I recognize you're here. Thank you.
In the wings. Thank you.
Thanks.
As all the last panelists depart, hopefully we will have all of our next panel.
Hi, Elise. I'm going to go ahead and make you co-host.
Great, thank you.
Do you want anyone else co-host with you?
No, I think as long as the non-co-hosts can share their screen, I think we're good.
They should be able to. Elise, if you can make an, oh, I'm going to stop the recording here.